Yeah, good evening to all of you. And speaking after Comrade Amarjit Kaur is a tough ask because she was full of fire and she spoke with such passion. But I am going to take a leaf from her very passionate delivery, as she argued very powerfully that the trade unions and labor laws date back to even the 19th century or the colonial period. I'm going to speak of a very well-known method of labor market governance, that is social dialogue. So I, of course, provocatively titled my speech as an obituary to social dialogue and dangers of Neo-Unilateralism. I'm going to speak on the historical as well as recent developments with regard to what has happened to social dialogue in general and tripartism in particular. Next slide, please. Yeah, social dialogue. I mean, social dialogue I would like to introduce by referring to the International Labour Organization, which is a very unique UN body, because it is unique in the sense it is its governance structure is tripartite in nature. And in fact, as the AITC is celebrating its centenary, the ILO had completed its centenary in 2019, formed as it was after the First World War. And ILO defines social dialogue as all types of negotiations, consultation, or simple exchanges of information, both formal and informal, between or among the representatives of governments, of employers and of workers at several levels, be they at national level or regional level or industry level or at the firm level, on issues of common interest relating to economic and social policy. Social policy would largely include labor and the policy concerning the environment. Now, international labor standards framework is given by the ILO, which largely comprises the ILO conventions, which once the member country ratifies become binding on them, the recommendations which are directive in nature, and of course the various paradigms that the International Labour Organization has issued from time to time. I'm going to touch upon briefly the decent work framework of the ILO. Now, there are two ways, there are two governance strategies or economic strategies or that one could find in the post-globalization period. One is a neoliberal strategy which individualizes and which is anti-collective and which seeks to weaken the collective rights of the collective organizations such as trade unions, non-governmental organizations and all people-based organizations, which does not believe in social dialogue, which believes in the power of the market, which believes that the profit maximization should be the dominant objective, which also believes in the philosophy of state retrenchment, which was advocated by the Washington Consensus, and which is which philosophy is largely driving many countries in the world, and we are moving away from left to the center and left of the center to the centrist to the right of the center kind of a framework. Opposed to that is the institutional perspective, which is largely centered on the International Labour Organization's International Labour Standard Framework, which calls for a kind of a middle perspective to be driven, policy making to be driven by high labor standards, which should be framed and constructed on the philosophy of social dialogue, social justice, which believes in formulating or looking at possibilities of achieving golden equilibrium between equity and efficiency, which believes in enhancing workers' voices, worker rights, and at the same time increasing the economic efficiency. So this is the kind of an institutional perspective which talks about delivery of social justice, people-centered law-making, policy-making processes, and also at the same time not compromising on economic efficiency. Now, Central to this international labor standard framework is social dialogue, which is a method of labor market governance. Now, there are the ILO in 1998 formed the core labor standards or the fundamental labor rights, which largely centers on 4 subjects, namely the freedom of association, collective bargaining, the protection against discrimination, prevention of prohibition of child labor and forced labor. Now, there are 2 conventions which are of importance here, which is Freedom of Association and Right to Organize Convention 1948, which is Convention 87. And the second one is the Right to Organize and Collective Bargaining Convention, which is Convention 98. Of the 8 fundamental ILO conventions, India has ratified 6 ILO conventions, and the conventions 87 and 98 are yet to be ratified. Of course, India has ratified, no, the previous one. For social dialogue, I would be focusing on the Tripartite Consultation International Labour Standards Convention 1976, which is C-144, and very importantly, Recommendation 205, which is Employment and Decent Work for Peace and Resilience Recommendation 2017. These two, one convention and one recommendation, has largely relied on social dialogue as a principal method of labor market governance and framing of labor laws and labor policies. And India has ratified Convention 144, and thereby we are bound to, the government at both levels, both the central and the state levels, bound to consult the social partners, namely the trade union representatives of workers' organizations, that is the central trade unions, and the employees' organizations. Next slide. Now I'm going to straight, because Professor Babu Matthew will be talking about the labor law changes. I'm just going to give it a context saying that, citing labor shortages or extraordinary COVID-19 times, economic distress, the need to attract investment, and to need to create employment given the high level of unemployment, various state governments in India, which comrade Amarjit Kaur mentioned elaborately, effected labor law changes in terms of raising the hours of work, or liberalizing the labor inspection system, or making substantial labor changes in the labor laws. I would say disruptive changes in the labor laws, particularly by Madhya Pradesh and also Uttar Pradesh. And as she said, Gujarat and Goa and Karnataka are likely to follow, or Gujarat has already sent the its ordinance to the government. UP and Gujarat have sent their ordinances to the government, which is pending President's assent. But the point to be noted is that the state governments have introduced disruptive labor law changes during the very troubled COVID-19 times in a unilateral manner, without referral to any kind of social dialogue mechanism. Next slide, please. Now, ILO has issued a detailed policy document. It argues for four key pillars in tackling the COVID-19 crisis on the basis of international labor standards. We have 4 squares: stimulating the economy through fiscal and monetary policies, supporting jobs and enterprises through social protection and employment retention, protecting workers at the workplace by providing occupational security and health, access to paid leave, about which Comrade Amarjit Kaur talked about, and non-discrimination of any kind. But the 4th block is very important for my presentation, which is social dialogue, strengthen the capacity of the tripartite actors, and also strengthen the processes which are tripartism at the macro level and bipartisan at the firm level. Next slide, please. Now, social dialogue in India dates back to the colonial times. During the Second World War, the British government introduced 2 sets of consultation mechanisms. One is the social dialogue, namely the tripartite mechanism, and the other one is the Labour Ministers' Conference. The social dialogue could be further be classified as per the International Labour Organization's definition: tripartism and bipartisan. Tripartism could be statutory, and that is under the various labor laws. There are provisions, say, under the Minimum Wages Act, or in the Contract Labor Regulation Abolition Act and so on and so forth, to constitute statutory consultative boards, recommending boards. On the voluntary side, we have the Indian Labour Conference and its secretariat called Standing Labour Committee. Both were formed in 1940, and it had I'll come to that. It played a very major role in the shaping of the labour laws, which Comrade Kaur had mentioned elaborately. At the state level, the government also thought, the government of India also conceived the state labour advisory boards. And of course, we have tripartite industry committees. And also we have the Labour Ministers Conference, which was largely conceived by the British government to bring about uniformity in the legislation across the states. Both are very important in today's context, and I'll tell you how they have been ignored. Next, please. So I'm providing a very broad, sweeping classification of tripartism. When I'm going to talk only of tripartism component of social dialogue, I'm going to speak about the role of state in indirectly and the regime differences directly. 1940 to 69, there was parity between state, labor, and capital, which is all about tripartism, and it was a welfare state which respected the constitution. And social dialogue, particularly tripartism, played a very creative role in terms of advising the government to frame labor laws and labor policies. In fact, the Planning Commission of India consulted workers' organizations during the formulation of the 5-year plans. And it produced a rich output of various central labor laws. 1950s and 1960s are called the decade, late 40s to late 60s are called the decades of labor regulation. And during this period, 26 Indian labor conferences were held. Then we come and post that 1972 to 1991, there was a lull in Indian Labour Conference. Tripartism was not active. And 1992 to 2014, there was a dominantly coalition politics, and the state was playing safe in terms of not introducing core labour law reforms about hire and fire and closure and labour flexibility, with Comrade Kaur has talked about. Though it was neoliberal largely in character, because it introduced the liberalization and privatization policies in a consolidated sense. 16 Indian Labour Conferences were held during this period, and a couple of commissions were set up, the Second National Commission on Labour and the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. But no core labour law reforms could be introduced. 2015 was the only time the Indian Labour Conference was held, and it was now from 2014 to 18 we have and 18 onwards we have a majoritarian party in leading the coalition of NDA. From 1940 to 69, where there was parity between the three partners and where labor was consulted largely, now it has become G2B. Government to business has become very dominant, and there is in place an aggressive and impatient state to introduce labor flexibility reforms. So there is no effective social dialogue. And at the regional level, which I'm sure Professor Matthew would speak in greater detail, core labor law reforms providing for labor law flexibility, even suspension of labor laws have been undertaken. And the code, national level, the 4 codes have also been in the process. Wage code has already been passed. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, tripartism, previous one, sorry. Tripartism has largely failed in the neoliberal period. There are many factors, but I'm going to highlight only the few. Indian Labour Conference was largely used by the government to push through its neoliberal reform agenda and to criticize labour regulation. I remember reading Dr. Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Vajpayee, and even the Prime Minister Narendra Modi making pejorative references to labour inspection system as Labour Inspector Raj and asking for its abolition. And also very often saying that the labor laws they only relate to a minority of workforce, namely 7 to 8% of the workforce, and there is a larger need to address the concerns of the unorganized sector. So there is a kind of a segmentation of labor market that took place in the discourses, pitting the unorganized sector against the organized sector. and paying lip services to ensuring labor interests and consulting trade unions before introducing the labor law reforms. This was a constant running theme in all the utterances by the government, either from the bureaucrats, the labor secretary, or the labor minister, or even the prime minister. And the trade unions have alleged, not without truth, that even the unanimous recommendations of the conference tripartite committees were not implemented by the government. The two examples that have been given are the minimum wage, the need to enforce the Indian Labour Conference 1957 recommendations concerning the construction of minimum wage, calculation of minimum wage, and absorbing the Anganwadi workers. And at the same time, the neoliberal law reforms had brought about a kind of a class solidarity. With due apologies to the organized workers movement, the trade union movement has been largely fragmented. For a long time, it was a left-initiated national countrywide struggles. But from 2010-11 thereabouts, a kind of consolidation took place, which of course is now facing some issues. I'm sure the labor movement will sort these issues out. As academics, we are interested in seeing a coordinated trade union movement maturing into a people's movement like the National Platform for Mass Organizations, which I'm sure the trade unions would have to think about in terms of constructing social movement unionism. But many of the consultations were outside tripartism, that is government to business. And concrete, effective policy and labor law related outcomes were generated because of the submissions given by various industry bodies. I have, through my research, identified a couple of labor law policy primers given by the Confederation of Indian Industry and FICCI, to mention the two. I'm also aware, and I'm in touch with the central trade unions. They have given numerous submissions to the government, even during as the codes were being made, but not many of their concerns have been addressed in the codes, which would require a separate webinar altogether. Since 2015, as Comrade Kaur has mentioned, there has not been Indian Labour Conference, save for an effort in 2018. Next slide, please. Now, I would call that the labor law making, or even the policy making, or even the relief measures announcement as Neo-Unilateralism. Now, why do I call it as Neo-Unilateralism? Unilateralism would mean that the state is not consulting either of the social partners, that is the employers' organizations and the workers' organizations. But it is given the character of this regime, which is neoliberal in character, where the state has interests which are synonymous with those of the business. They could be clubbed into a common interest group, and thereby the state actions largely reflect those of the business industry's concerns, and to a very minority, to a very minor extent, that of the welfare of the workers. So I have in order to differentiate between perfect unilateralism and kind of a nuanced unilateralism, I call it as a neo-unilateralism. That is, and in this, because the government does not want to either listen to the intellectuals, nor any commissions or committees, nor the trade unions' voices. It goes about making labor laws and policies listening to only one voice. Next, and I call this as neo-unilateralism of the neoliberal regime. Next slide, please. So there are two propositions of the neoliberal logic. It's a globalized economy. There is a need for quick labor law reforms. Ease of doing business is much more important than the labor rights. So there is a tremendous need for flexible labor laws, which is not entirely untrue, being an academician. And how do we go about introducing the labor law reforms? Social dialogue is costly, frustrating, time-consuming, so it can be dispensed with, which is consistent with the neoliberal regime. There are three scenarios for social dialogue. Where trade unions are strong, which is at the national level, there is a coordinated union movement. Keep the social dialogue alive, tripartism alive, have symbolic consultations. In fact, the IR code on which I am writing a paper for Economic and Political Weekly clearly mentions that the IR code has been framed with the consultations with the trade unions and the employers' organizations. Where trade unions are fragmented, This is where the trade union movement has to really look at. They are concentrating at the national level and losing at the state level, where the political fragmentation is very high. So avoid or ignore social dialogue. I'm afraid the State Labor Advisory Board is either not functional or least functional. And at the firm level, allow the market forces, product market and the labor market to function, and the collective bargaining outcomes will be decided by the relative bargaining power of capital vis-a-vis the labor. Or it can also lead to union consultation in good firms like Tata Steel, Mahindra, and other firms. On the other hand, to union busting or avoidance of unions, which everybody knows. So the reform spaces are primarily at the national level. It's still to take place, but in the meanwhile, at the regional level, which are faster, and at the micro level, where social dialogue is either absent or subject to market dynamics. Next slide, please. So the hazards of unilateralism: the labor market outcomes are not optimal outcomes. Neglect or failure of tripartism will lead to unilateral determination, of course, in consultation with industry. Use of non-legislative methods like ordinances and government orders. Fixed-term employment was issued through a government ordinance in March 2018, and various state governments have adopted ordinances. And even the Industrial Relations Code, Chapter 10, allows the state governments to modify the threshold for Chapter 5B in the ID Act, Chapter 10 in the Industrial Relations Code by executive order. Mediocre outcomes. This is where I want the the society to wake up and listen. Take cognizance of. There are Neo-Unilateralism will lead to mediocre outcomes. Changes are often mostly slanted towards one side because the state listens to only the one side, the capital, and of course it produces low labor standards or weak or no labor institutions. Secondly, it leads to a mediocre governance regime, and the state is in a hurry to pass the labor laws which are poorly drafted. The UP ordinance is a classic case. I'm sure Professor Babu Matthew will be appalled as a long-standing professor of labor law. It is the 1.5 pages of legislation. In fact, the central government had to send a correspondence to the government of Uttar Pradesh and government of Gujarat, asking them which are the labor laws they want to exempt from. This is the level of mediocrity that India has never witnessed. India is known for its bureaucracy and hesitance to seek ILO's technical cooperation. I have visited China, and the labor contract law has been made in 2007-8, and I learned from the from the social partners there that the government of China consulted International Labour Organization and also consulted the public in framing the labor law contract law, which is a very significant labor law reform that took place. Government of India must consult ILO's technical cooperation. It has the global expertise in order to draft these labor laws, and of course the trade unions are already urging the government to do so. Next one, please. Next one. So voice deficits leads to all kinds of mediocre outcomes, and race to bottom of labor standards, rising informality, diminution of labor welfare, weakening of aggregate demand leading because of underemployment due to informality, unemployment, and lower levels of income. And lower levels of income of the households lead to lower level of savings by the households, and lower levels of savings means lower capital formation, which is material capital formation, and lower level of human capital investment. Imagine contract workers, daily wage earners with less than minimum wages, around the minimum wages, spending money for the children's education, health, nutrition. So it is going to create a society in the next 30 years, a society which is not sound on human capital. So the low wage, cheap labor capital strategy of the neoliberalism is not only going to hurt, is not only going to promote suboptimal outcomes in the present, but also suboptimal outcomes in the future. I urge the trade union movement to take this particular dimension of not only the the problem with the present, the contemporary problems, but also the futuristic problems, and it leads to poor labor market governance. ILO is very clear in his advice, as we saw earlier, that sound labor market governance means listening to the social partners and going by consensus and evidence-based social dialogue. I urge all parties concerned as an academician to revive social dialogue and frame labor law policies, social and economic policies, which promote at once equity and economic efficiency. Thank you very much.